Hello there, many thanks for joining us on our Thursday Business News Report. It's now time to bring you a feature on the show today as we focus on the state of the Nigerian economy. Now, the latest report from the World Bank is pushing that the Nigerian economy is going to grow by 2.5% this year, up from an estimated 2.4% growth, which was earlier announced in 2021. The bank, in its January 2022 Global Economic Prospects report published on Tuesday, said Nigeria's growth is projected to strengthen somewhat, 2.5% this year and then 2.8% in 2023. It cited the rebound to higher oil prices as well as accelerated growth in telecommunication and financial services. Joining me now in our Lagos studio to discuss this and much more, I have Ayodele Adio, the managing editor of Daily Avalon. Happy New Year and many thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we are having this forecast by the World Bank and other international bodies projecting that Nigeria's economy is going to grow at certain rates. We are having varying figures here. The World Bank says 2.5%. The federal government is pushing at about 4% thereabout. How do you see things really playing out this year, especially when we look at this margin, much smaller than the rate of the population growth rate, unemployment growth rate, those who are falling below the poverty line. These are growing at faster paces than our GDP, so we cannot say the economy is faring well. Do you understand that sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, 2.5 does us no good, to be very honest with you. That will essentially mean that in the last 6 years, we've averaged growth at a negative. If you compare that with, like you rightfully said, our population growth rate, which completely swallows up any growth that you could have celebrated, especially when it's within the range of 2.5 or even 5% growth rate. What we really need to see happen is that our country is growing at least 8%, between 8 and 10% year on year for the next decade.
Isn't that so ambitious?
I mean, it's not so ambitious. We have a number of African countries already growing at that particular rate. And I think it's possible, and it was a missed opportunity. If you recall, I think it was sometime last year, I'm still struggling, it's 2 years ago, it's still a new year. It was 2 years ago when the country shut down its borders, which essentially hindered growth in almost all sectors of the economy. And if you looked at the numbers in that particular year, we performed very dismally, largely owing to the fact that we're unable to trade with countries around our borders. So many of these challenges that we're facing at the moment were self-inflicted. I mean, I quite understand the fact that the dip in oil prices about 2-3 years ago played a significant role. I understand that the COVID-19 pandemic also played a significant role. But to assume that 2.5 in 2020 is going to move the needle forward is a bit too optimistic. I think we need to grow much faster than that at a more sustained level over the next decade for us to first be able to double per capita income and for us to grow at a pace where we can create meaningful opportunities for average Nigerians.
And talking about the per capita income, it is expected that it's going to be lower than a decade ago in countries like Nigeria, Angola, South Africa. Now, when we're doing comparative analysis of how Nigeria's economy is faring to the likes of Ghana and a whole lot, and you look at the value of the naira as well, it's quite disappointing to see that we are seeing a dwindling value. But at the end of the day now, how do we begin to gradually stimulate the economy? Yes, there's, according to some, there's still going to be some false liquidity and flow of cash because this is the pre-election year, but that does not necessarily mimic the true state of the economy. How do we begin to stimulate the economy, have much more job creation, and also have the masses feel the impact? We're going to have the removal of subsidy from fuel this year. We are going to see increment in electricity tariff. All of these are fears of the everyday man because it is getting much more expensive to feed, to move around, to live. Literally.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things need to happen, honestly. And I mean, we have to all, on the strategy table, it looks to me like we focus a whole lot on our monetary policy, which is good. And many of the decisions that have been taken in the last couple of years have been driven by the CBN. We need to see a lot more coming from the fiscal strategy point of view. in terms of more economic planning and implementation of a clear vision that has clearly been articulated by this administration. The problem is that it just hasn't followed through with it. So you ask what needs to be done. I think, first of all, there needs to be some sort of diversification of our economy. I know we mount that every single time. But at the moment, if you look at the 2022 budget estimates, over 80% of our foreign exchange is still going to be coming from oil. That needs to change very quickly. That means we must begin to invest in value-added production within our economy to ensure that we can export beyond oil and export a lot of all our valuable products in our country. That means we need to invest in processing, we need to invest in research and development. We need that, of course, that consequently means we need to invest more in education so that we can raise our human capital value. We also need to think beyond subsistence agriculture. Agriculture, yes, has the potential to lift people out of poverty. It has the potential to create jobs. But if we're going to be doing agriculture with hoes and cutlasses, we're not going to make progress. It has to be mechanized. It has to be linked to industry. It has to be linked to processing factories that has the capacity to absorb thousands of jobs. That's how we're able to make progress. We need to trade more within our borders. We need to give incentives that allow trades to thrive. We need to de-risk, we need to lower the rate of the cost of borrowing from banks in the country. At the moment, you have to be a drug dealer to be able to pay the kinds of interest rates that banks are charging at the moment if you're running a legitimate business. So all of these things and a whole lot more need to be done, but the priority has to be growth, and growth. The economy has to grow as big and as fast as possible for us to have any chance in getting out of this hole that we found ourselves in.
But one element that also stifles any chance of growth is the reality of insecurity in the country at this point in time. That's a big matter that we just have to change our approach. Government has to do better. But now, wrapping up our conversation now, looking at output, it has gradually rebounded last year. Some believe it's going to get a little better this year. But with the curveball COVID-19, we never can tell what's going to play out next. We've seen the Omicron variant, we've seen the Delta Cron, and other variants are coming to bear. If there is anyone that might have to force us to look at restriction of mobility and a whole lot more, how do you see these projections playing out?
To be honest, I don't think we should have COVID-19 on the table. And I'm saying this not because I want people to act irresponsibly. But I think the cost of shutting down your economy outweighs whatever
even if we didn't shut down ours and other economies are shutting theirs.
I'm not sure that there's any economy that will be willing to shut down in the near future, because the damage that the lockdowns across the world cost economies is one that has dragged so many economies backwards. And so I am not sure that any African country, especially Nigeria, should consider anything remotely close to wanting to shut down the economy because of COVID. I think it's here to stay. I think we would have to find clever ways of dealing with it, be more responsible around it. But it is not an option to be considered. And I don't think it should also be an excuse for those who are planning our economy going forward. It really shouldn't be on the table. Of course, like I said, it doesn't mean people should be irresponsible, but it should no longer be an excuse for why we perform badly in our economy.
Okay, now, looking at our fiscal and monetary policies, we're going into somewhat an uncharted territory because it's a fresh new year and we cannot necessarily say what will play out. But looking at exchange rates, inflation, our debt sustainability, as you said, it does not necessarily mimic the outlook like we have our hands on deck and know how to manage all of these. With the economic growth still fragile at this state, you look at exchange rates, you look at inflation, and the level of borrowing from government, and that body language still remains, we only have a revenue generation challenge. Do you think, as the President Muhammadu Buhari administration is wrapping up, a clear stance will be taken much more this year to ensure that we have enough of stimulant, and then there is an agenda that was clearly stated before the exit?
Well, I mean, if you looked at the budget, it doesn't look like there's any real stimulant in that particular budget that was passed. In fact, what we have seen in that budget is that we have also equally increased the amount that we'll be borrowing. We've increased fiscal deficit. We'll be borrowing more. I think 22% will be going into debt servicing in the budget that we have. They talk about having just, in quote, just the problem of revenue generation, but it's a real problem, because we'll be borrowing about 6.4 trillion to be able to fund our deficit this year. In the last 6 years, we've borrowed about 22 trillion. That's staggering, because these funds would have to be paid over the next few years. And if we don't find means of generating or improving our revenue streams, we'll find ourselves in a real debt crisis. And so, I mean, you looked at this budget, we're going to be spending, our estimates is to raise about 10 trillion naira from revenue. From that, we're going to be spending about 5.8 trillion on recurrent expenditure. 4.1 of that will be going on salaries and basic salaries of workers, and you're even going to be spending less than the 5.8 trillion on capital expenditure. So you see that we're running in like a vicious cycle.
Is faulty.
Yeah, so
that's
so,
a similar
so
approach
like a vicious circle where not enough investment is going into education, into healthcare, because I think we're spending about 1 trillion naira on education, roughly less than 10% of the budget. We're also spending about 8% of the budget on health. Both of them are below the 15% estimates of UNESCO for countries to spend on education and budget. So we're not funding our priorities enough. We're not raising or improving our revenue streams. We're borrowing more. It's a recipe for disaster. So we need to begin to think differently as to how we're going to expand our revenue streams. I know that, like you rightfully said earlier, we want to stop paying subsidies on petrol and electricity. I think we spend about 30 billion on electricity every year and trillions of naira on subsidizing petrol. Now, what we do with those savings is what will determine how our economy would respond. Of course, there will be short-term shocks with the price increase in petrol and electricity, which is why I advocate that those increases are staggered and not done immediately. But of course, if we reinvest those savings, those trillions of naira that will be saved from those subsidy programs, back into the economy in a clever, systematic, and well-planned manner, and I think we'll be able to make some meaningful progress.
We'll still keep our fingers crossed to see how this year's budget implementation is going to take place, and even last year's, because we have an extension till March before we can do a fair analysis of how well the budget has played out in the last 2 years. And this is the final exit for the president. Hopefully we also have a clear agenda for the next administration that would also come in. Thank you very much for your time on the breakfast show this morning. Thank you for speaking with you.